Have you ever felt invisible? Like no matter how hard you worked, how much you sacrificed, the world refused to see you for who you really were? If so, let me tell you about Isaac Monroe. Isaac wasn't just a man, he was a force. The kind of person who built his success with his own hands, carving out a life from nothing but sheer determination and grit. Raised in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago, Isaac knew struggle intimately. His mother worked 2 jobs, barely scraping by, while his father, well, he was just another ghost in a long line of broken promises. From the moment he could walk, Isaac learned that the only person he could truly count on was himself. By the time he was 16, he had already mastered the art of survival. He juggled school, a part-time job, a local grocery store, and late-night study sessions, fueled by the dim glow of a street lamp outside his window. College, that was a dream too expensive to afford. But Isaac didn't wait for handouts. He fought for every scholarship, every opportunity, and when the doors refused to open, he kicked them down. Years later, armed with an MBA and a relentless drive, he climbed his way up the corporate ladder, stepping over every obstacle in his path. Now, at 42, Isaac sat at the head of his own empire, a billion-dollar logistics company that had reshaped the industry. His name commanded respect, his presence demanded attention. But power didn't erase the scars of the past. He still remembered the feeling of being underestimated, dismissed, treated as if he were less than. And as much as he had changed, some things never did. Which is why, on one particularly cold Wednesday morning, he found himself standing outside one of his own distribution centers, dressed in a worn-out hoodie, scuffed jeans, and a delivery cap pulled low over his brow. He was supposed to be in a board meeting, listening to well-tailored executives toss around figures and forecasts. Instead, he was here, blending into the background, just another worker in the sea of nameless faces. The decision to go undercover hadn't been planned. It came after a late-night report crossed his desk, whispers of corruption, mistreatment of workers, and a toxic culture brewing under his nose. He'd built his company on the foundation of fairness, respect, and integrity. If something was rotting beneath the surface, he needed to see it with his own eyes. And so, he stripped away the suit, the title, the prestige, and walked into the world as just another man trying to make a living. What he saw in the first hour was enough to make his stomach turn. Supervisors barking orders like drill sergeants, workers moving like shadows, fear stitched into their every step. And then there was the boardroom, the ivory tower where decisions were made by men who never set foot in the warehouses, men who saw workers as numbers on a spreadsheet rather than the backbone of the company. It was in that moment, standing in the break room clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee, that Isaac made a silent promise. By the time this day was over, everything was going to change. He just had to wait for the right moment to strike. Isaac spent the first few hours blending in, moving from station to station, lifting boxes, scanning packages, and watching. He saw tired workers pushing past their limits, their movements mechanical, their eyes dull. He caught snippets of hushed conversations, grievances muttered under breath, frustration swallowed whole. But it was in the break room that he truly started to see the problem. The workers barely spoke above a whisper. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension, a shared exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the weight of something bigger. And then, as if summoned by the very essence of that tension, the warehouse manager strode in. His name was Craig Withers, a thick, overconfident man in his mid-50s, with a gut that strained against his expensive button-up and a smirk that reeked of unchecked power. He wasn't just an authority figure here. He was a tyrant, and from the way the workers stiffened at his presence, Isaac knew Craig ruled with fear. "Break's over," Craig barked, without so much as a glance at the clock. A few workers hurriedly stuffed their sandwiches back into their bags, the kind of reflex built from knowing that arguing would only make things worse. Isaac stayed seated. He could feel Craig's gaze land on him, sharp and scrutinizing. "I said break's over," Craig repeated, his voice louder now, tinged with irritation. Isaac lifted his head slowly. He was still hunched over his coffee, playing the role of the quiet, weary worker. "Still got 3 minutes," he said casually. The room fell into a stunned silence. Craig's eyes narrowed. "You knew?" Isaac nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Craig took a step forward, looming over him. "Then let me explain something, rookie. Around here, when I say break's over, it's over." Isaac let the silence stretch, let the tension thicken until Craig shifted, clearly expecting an apology. Instead, Isaac took another slow sip of his coffee. "That right?" he said finally. Craig's smirk twitched into a sneer. "Yeah, that's right." Isaac set his cup down and stood up, letting his full height come into view. He wasn't an intimidating man by nature, but he knew how to carry himself. Years of commanding rooms full of executives had taught him that much. And yet, Craig didn't back down. He didn't recognize him. Not yet. "Get back to work," Craig snapped, eyes narrowing. Isaac met his gaze for a second longer before turning away. Not out of obedience, but calculation. He needed to see more before he revealed himself. But Craig wasn't done. Over the next few hours, Isaac witnessed it all. Workers being berated for minor mistakes, forced to skip meals to meet quotas, and threatened with termination, like their livelihoods were nothing more than a joke. He watched Craig humiliate a man for taking too long in the restroom, then laugh as he stumbled back to his station, face red with shame. And then came the moment that sealed Craig's fate. A young worker, barely in his 20s, had been struggling with a particularly heavy package. His face was damp with sweat, his hands trembling from exhaustion, but he was pushing through it, until his grip slipped, and the package tumbled to the ground with a heavy thud. The warehouse went still. Craig's expression darkened as he marched over, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. The young worker looked up, already bracing for impact. "You deaf boy," Craig sneered. "Didn't I tell you to be careful?" I'm sorry," the worker stammered, scrambling to pick up the box. "Sorry," Craig let out a cruel chuckle. "Sorry don't pay for broken goods." Then, without warning, he reached out and shoved the worker backward. Gasps rippled through the warehouse. Isaac's vision tunneled. The worker staggered but caught himself, his eyes wide with shock and humiliation. Craig smirked, glancing around at the stunned workers. "Anyone else want to start screwing up today?" No one moved. And that's when Isaac knew. This wasn't just a bad manager. This was a man who had been allowed to get away with this for far too long. But not anymore. Isaac clenched his fists, every ounce of his restraint hanging by a thread. Craig Withers had just made the worst mistake of his career, because in less than 24 hours, he'd be out of a job. And so would every other executive who let this happen. Isaac clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering in his ears. The warehouse was suffocatingly silent, save for the hum of conveyor belts and the distant beeping of forklifts. But all eyes were locked on Craig, the man who had just humiliated one of his own workers for no reason other than sheer, unrestrained cruelty. The young worker, still trembling from the shove, kept his gaze downcast, fists clenched at his sides. But Isaac could see it, the shame pooling in his expression, the quiet rage buried beneath years of learned helplessness. Craig exhaled sharply through his nose and clapped his hands together. "All right, show's over. Get back to work before I find more people to fire." Fire. The word sent a ripple of fear through the crowd. Isaac had seen enough. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, positioning himself between Craig and the young worker. The movement drew Craig's attention, and when he met Isaac's eyes, there was a flicker of annoyance, no recognition yet, just irritation that someone dared to defy him. "You got a problem, rookie?" Craig sneered. Isaac tilted his head slightly. "Yeah, I do." A few murmurs rippled through the workers, their eyes darting between the two men. Craig's smirk widened, relishing the idea of another public humiliation. "Oh, and what's that?" Isaac took a breath, steadying himself. This wasn't about him. This was about every single worker in this warehouse who had been pushed around and forced to swallow their dignity for the sake of a paycheck. He let his voice drop, smooth and controlled. You shoved him. Craig scoffed. And he was too damn slow. I don't pay for mistakes. Isaac's stomach twisted with fury, but he kept his tone measured. That's assault. Craig rolled his eyes. Oh, shut up with that HR bull. I've been running this place for years, and you know what? The only reason we hit quotas is because I don't let weaklings drag us down. His voice dripped with arrogance. You want to cry about it? Fine, but don't expect anyone to care. Isaac stared at him, something cold settling in his chest. The problem wasn't just Craig. It was the system that had let men like him thrive. Craig leaned in slightly, his smirk deepening. And in case you forgot, you're nothing but a temp. I could have you out that door before lunch. He clapped a heavy hand on Isaac's shoulder. So how about you be a good little grunt and... Isaac grabbed Craig's wrist. Not hard, not aggressive, just firm. A silent warning. Craig froze, his face twisting with incredulous rage. What the hell do you think you're? I think you should stop talking, Isaac said calmly. Then, in a voice just loud enough for the room to hear, because in about 10 minutes, you're going to regret every word you've just said. A hush fell over the warehouse. Workers exchanged glances, uncertain yet intrigued. Craig blinked, his brain working to process the sudden shift in dynamic. And then, the double doors at the far end of the warehouse burst open. A group of sharply dressed men and women entered, corporate executives, HR representatives, and security personnel, their polished shoes clacking against the concrete floor. At their head was a tall man in a tailored navy suit, his expression tight, with barely concealed fury. His name was Daniel Graves, Isaac's right-hand man and the company's chief operating officer. Craig paled. What? Daniel's voice cut through the warehouse like a blade. Craig Withers. Craig turned toward him, already fumbling for words. Dan, Mr. Graves, what are you doing, H? Silence. Daniel's eyes scanned the room, the disgust evident in his expression. Then his gaze flicked to Isaac. Craig turned back to Isaac, suddenly taking him in again, as if seeing him for the first time. He saw the way the executives deferred to him, the way security stood at attention, waiting for his signal. And then, like a slow-moving train wreck, the realization crashed into him. Isaac Monroe wasn't a temp. He was the CEO. Craig's face drained of color. Isaac exhaled softly and let go of Craig's wrist, stepping back just slightly, giving the man a moment to fully grasp the depths of his mistake. Craig swallowed hard. This. He turned to Daniel, his voice cracking. This is a misunderstanding. I was just keeping discipline, making sure the team stays on track. Daniel didn't even blink. We've been gathering reports on you for months, Withers. And after today, we have everything we need. Craig took a stumbling step back. You can't be serious. Isaac finally spoke, his voice even. You've spent years mistreating workers, covering up safety violations, and fostering a culture of fear and intimidation. He gestured toward the exhausted employees, the ones Craig had belittled and bullied. These people keep this company running, and you treat them like dirt. Craig's mouth opened and closed, his entire body shaking now. Isaac, Mr. Monroe, please. He shot a desperate glance at the other executives, but none of them met his gaze. He was alone. Isaac tilted his head slightly. You remember what you said earlier? About firing people before lunch. He let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. Well, Craig breaks over. 2 security guards stepped forward. And just like that, Craig Withers, the warehouse tyrant, was escorted out of the building in front of the very people he had spent years abusing. For the first time since Isaac had stepped foot in that warehouse, the room erupted, not with fear, but with a long-overdue sense of justice. And Isaac, he had only just begun. Craig Withers was gone, dragged out of the warehouse, his protests drowned under the weight of his own arrogance. But his departure wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As the door slammed shut behind him, the workers stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. They had spent years under Craig's rule, bending under his cruelty, swallowing their voices out of fear. And now, just like that, he was gone. Isaac turned to face them, scanning their faces. Some were still cautious, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Others dared to hope. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice broke the silence. "Is he really gone?" Isaac nodded. "He won't be back." A murmur spread through the warehouse, a ripple of disbelief giving way to something bigger. Relief. Daniel Graves, Isaac's COO, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Effective immediately. Craig Withers has been terminated. And he's not the only one." He held up a folder. "Over the next week, we'll be conducting a full investigation into the management practices here. Anyone found abusing their power the way Craig did, anyone who turned a blind eye, will be held accountable." The workers exchanged looks, shock settling into their bones. This wasn't just about Craig. This was about every supervisor who had looked the other way, every manager who had let the abuse continue unchecked. A heavy-set man in his 50s, one of the senior floor supervisors, stepped forward cautiously. His name tag read Howard. He swallowed hard, looking from Isaac to Daniel. "And what about us?" he asked, voice wary. "The people who just did their jobs? The ones who had to put up with it?" Isaac met his gaze. "That's why I'm here." He took a step closer, his voice carrying across the warehouse floor. "I built this company from nothing. I know what it means to work your way up, to do the hard jobs, to fight for your place. And I know how easy it is for people in power to forget that." He let his gaze sweep over the workers. "But I haven't forgotten." A murmur of agreement spread. "This place will change," Isaac continued. "No more threats. No more fear. We're restructuring leadership from the ground up, and that means better wages, better hours, and above all, respect." He looked at Howard, then at the young worker Craig had humiliated. "You deserve that. Every single one of you." For the first time, something unspoken passed between him and the workers. Not just authority. Trust. Daniel cleared his throat. "We'll also be conducting worker interviews. If you've been mistreated, tell us. We want to know everything. No more silence." A hand shot up from the back. A woman with sharp eyes and calloused hands. "And if we do," she asked, "what happens then?" Isaac didn't hesitate. "Then the people responsible will answer for it." Another murmur. Then slowly, someone started clapping. It was hesitant at first, like they weren't sure if it was allowed. But then another joined, and another, until the entire warehouse was filled with the sound of applause. Isaac let out a slow breath. This was what justice felt like. But karma? That was still coming. 1 week later, Craig Withers sat in his car, staring blankly at his phone. The same phone that had once been filled with work emails, messages from executives, notifications of meetings where he could wield his power. Now, nothing. He had been fired. Publicly. Humiliated in front of the very people he had spent years breaking down. But it wasn't just the job, it was everything. The severance package he had assumed he'd get. Gone. The corporate contacts who had once treated him with deference. Silent. His name was poisoned now, blacklisted from every major company in the industry. And the news? Oh, the news had been brutal. An investigative piece had gone live just 3 days after his firing, detailing the reports of abuse, the toxic work environment, the long list of OSHA violations swept under the rug under his leadership. His face was plastered all over social media, a symbol of corporate cruelty finally getting its due. He had thought he was untouchable. Now he couldn't even get a call back for an interview. A knock on his car window made him jump. He turned, heart pounding, only to see a delivery guy standing there, holding a brown paper bag. Craig rolled the window down slightly. "What?" he snapped. The delivery guy raised an eyebrow. "Order for Craig Withers?" Craig scowled but grabbed the bag, reaching into his wallet. But the moment he saw the name on the receipt, his stomach dropped. Isaac Monroe. Craig's head snapped up. The delivery guy smirked. From the CEO. He says, "Enjoy the free meal. It's the last handout you'll be getting." Craig's face burned. His fingers curled around the bag, knuckles white. But before he could say a word, the delivery guy turned and walked off, whistling. Craig Withers had spent years making others feel powerless. Now, he finally understood what that felt like. Back at the warehouse, Isaac stood in the break room, watching as his workers, laughed, talked, and for the first time in years, actually took their full break without fear. He smiled. This was just the beginning. Isaac Monroe stood near the loading dock, watching as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the warehouse floor. The place felt different now. Lighter. The weight that had hung over it for so long had been lifted, and for the first time in years, people weren't just working. They were living. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of cardboard, machine oil, and something new. Hope. As workers moved about, some still cautious, some laughing freely, Isaac thought about the past week. The flood of stories that had come out after Craig's firing. The quiet ones who had finally found their voices. The managers who had turned in their resignations out of guilt or fear. And the others, the good ones, who had stayed, determined to help rebuild the company into something better. It had been exhausting. Meetings, investigations, restructuring. But Isaac didn't regret a second of it. Because this was why he had started the company in the first place. Not to sit in a penthouse, detached from the people who made it all possible. Not to let power turn into cruelty. He had almost lost sight of that. Almost. A voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Sir." He turned to see the young worker, Tyrell, standing there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked nervous, but determined. "Yeah," Isaac said. Tyrell hesitated. I wanted to say thank you. For everything." Isaac studied him. The same kid Craig had humiliated in front of everyone. The same kid who, a week ago, had been on the verge of quitting, thinking no one in power cared. Isaac shook his head. "Don't thank me. Just promise me something." Tyrell frowned. "What?" "Remember this feeling," Isaac said. "Someday, you might be the one in charge. And when that day comes, remember what it felt like to be standing where you are now." Tyrell nodded, his expression serious. "I will." Isaac clapped him on the shoulder before heading back inside. There was still so much work to do. Craig Withers was gone, but the damage he had caused wouldn't disappear overnight. Trust had to be rebuilt. Systems had to be fixed. And Isaac knew there would always be people like Craig, waiting for the chance to rise to power and abuse it. But that was the thing about power. It didn't reveal character. It exposed it. And as long as Isaac Monroe was at the helm, this company would never forget the lesson they had all learned. Power wielded without compassion would always, eventually, collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Isaac had made sure of that.